Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. I'm your host today, Valentino Stoll, and we're joined by a very special guest today, Andy Mala. Did I say that right, Andy?
Andy Male. Yep.
Male. Sorry, I should have asked you before.
No worries.
Well, welcome. Do you want to just introduce yourself? And I'm sure some people have heard you before on our show here, but just give everybody an introduction and why you're famous.
Yeah, sure. My name is Andy Male. I have about 20 years of software engineering experience, and I've been programming since I was a kid, really. I have a bachelor degree in computer science from McGill University in Montreal and a master's degree in software engineering from DePaul University, Chicago. And I guess I became famous when I won the Fukuoka Ruby Award in 2022 for my project Glimmer DSL for libui. Which I presented at RubyConf 3 times already, and I'm going to present it for the 4th time this year. And I've also spoken at RailsConf twice before.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know you won the Fukuoka Ruby Award. Congratulations on that.
I won one of the awards, a special Fukuoka Ruby Award. That's what it was called.
Awesome. So what is Glimmer?
So Glimmer started originally as a desktop development GUI library. It was I started it in the mid-2000s as a way of making myself learn Ruby. At the time, I was a Java developer, and I did a lot of Java desktop development work at a couple of companies. And I heard about Ruby, and I saw Rails, and I thought it was awesome. And I'm like, why don't we do this on the desktop? All the cool things that Ruby offers, as far as meta programming, as far as building DSLs, and all of that, we can build GUIs with it on the desktop. So I checked out what are my options at the time that were built by other people, and I saw Shoes, and I saw TK, and Ruby TK did not have a DSL. It was writing code for it was very ugly. It felt like I'm writing Java code, so I didn't like working with it. Shoes was very nice, but unfortunately it was a bit not very well maintained, and it had bugs, and it would crash randomly. So I built Glimmer originally as a Ruby layer on top of the Eclipse SWT library, which is used in the Eclipse IDE because that's what I used at work at the time. So I built it using JRuby because it had to run on top of the JVM. Eventually, the idea proved itself to be interesting and useful enough to a point where I ended up then covering all the available GUI toolkits in Ruby with Glimmer. So I have a Glimmer DSL for TK now, Glimmer DSL for GTK, for FX Ruby, meaning Fox Toolkit. For libui is a library that's a bit recent. That was one of the more recent Glimmers that were built. And the most recent one is WX widgets. Has been covered by Glimmer recently because somebody built a new binding called WX Ruby that replaced the old WX Ruby just a couple of years ago. So I ended up also covering it with a Glimmer DSL. But to get back to the question, what happened is eventually I ended up last year coming up with the idea of building Glimmer DSL for web, which is a web version of Glimmer that uses all the innovations for data binding that were used in desktop development, but with building web user interfaces.
So, I mean, the first thing I think of when I think of cross-platform desktop apps is Electron, and maybe maybe I'm just old. I don't really know if that's still used even. Is that a close comparison to what we're talking about?
So the irony is that Electron is not real desktop. So Electron runs on top of embedded browsers.
Oh, okay.
So it's actually, you write the app in actually HTML and CSS. So unfortunately, as a result of that, you forego all the simplicity of desktop GUI toolkit development, because desktop GUIs are usually a lot simpler than web GUIs because they have limitations that are enforced to comply with operating system standards like on Mac OS or Windows. So it's a lot faster to build a desktop app with a desktop GUI toolkit than to build it with HTML and CSS. I think so. Electron runs on top of a browser. So the good news is that browsers are a desktop app. Everybody who is doing web development uses desktop apps because the browser is a desktop application. But Electron is not real desktop development. Cross-platform GUI toolkits are actually a lot simpler to use than Electron.
I see that. It makes a ton of sense. I guess like thinking about like styling, are you pretty like restricted then to of like the operating systems style limitations for a lot of these components?
Yeah, so the good news is that it's like the 80-20 rule. In general, you write very simple GUIs that comply to the style guidelines, and you can write those GUIs very quickly with very little code using Glimmer. But 20% of the time, when you need to have your own customizations, you can actually build completely custom user interfaces from scratch if you prefer. But then you have to do a lot more work. So you can actually do things that are the same things that you could do with HTML and CSS, but in desktop. Like basically you draw on a canvas. You can do anything with a canvas. But in general, it's discouraged in desktop development unless you have an app that's actually drawing diagrams or doing things like visual games, 2D games or stuff like that. In general, if you don't have diagrams or games or anything that's very like custom, it's better to stick to the, like using standard GUI toolkit controls like text field, list, combo box, etc.
It's interesting you mentioned gaming aspects because I know the Ruby gaming engine of choice lately is Dragon Ruby. And I know that kind of like evolved from Ruby Motion as like the de facto like desktop builder application. I don't know if that's still maintained or not. Is there any comparison like you can make between Glimmer and Ruby Motion?
Yeah, sure. So Ruby Motion has two parts. There's the Ruby Motion mobile development aspect of it, and that one supports iOS and Android development using Ruby code. I've actually tested it to build a demo, like a proof of concept iOS app, and it works. It's very nice. It might have been last year or the year before was when I tested it. It still works. And then they have a desktop component where you can, but it's not cross-platform. It's only for the Mac. So that part overlaps a bit with Glimmer, but I would not use it. I would rather use Glimmer because when you build a Glimmer app once, it runs on all platforms. And if you're using one of the native GUI toolkits like libui, wxWidgets, or SWT, your apps will look native on every platform as well. But the mobile aspect of Ruby Motion is very cool. Actually, I do want to explore the idea of building a Glimmer DSL for Ruby Motion mobile. That would be very cool because then I can write the app in Ruby with a nice DSL and it would run on Mac OS and Android, not Mac, iOS and Android. So that's something that would be interesting to explore. But otherwise, Dragon Ruby is more optimized for gaming. And Glimmer allows you to build games, but it's not optimized for games. It's not about like offering you the best performance for games or anything like that. Although its libraries are pretty optimized for performance, like they do run fast, but the library itself is not tailored towards gaming. I would still recommend if people want to build complex games, Dragon Ruby is definitely the way to go. Or something else like Ruby 2D, or there are a few other Ruby libraries for gaming as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, he's the best tool for the best job.
Mm-hmm.
And I love, so like, thank you for the backstory in Glimmer. And I mean, we had you on today to talk about this new, thing you've been working on with Glimmer Web, which is fascinating to me. What drew you in this direction? Do you want to describe maybe what the Glimmer DSL for Web is? And it's because it's funny you mentioned that we as web developers are really desktop app developers. So you want to just like dive into how that correlates?
Yeah, sure. I've personally experienced building desktop apps with Glimmer for quite a while now, and it's very quick to build any idea I have. Like if I like one day I needed the metronome. I actually play drums as a hobby, and my phone metronome app got a bug in it after the latest update. So I ended up building my own metronome with Glimmer as a desktop app, and I built it. I built the first MVP version in 10 minutes, and it was like so amazing because of Ruby. Like, Ruby's so awesome, so I noticed that I don't have the same productivity in web front-end interface development using JavaScript. Not even close. Like JavaScript is so cumbersome, even the newest versions of JavaScript are so like over-engineered, and they focus on premature optimizations that are not important whatsoever. So because of all of that, like for example, like JavaScript makes you worry nowadays about const versus let, which to me, like as a Rubyist, that's the least of my concerns when I'm building a business app. I just want to focus on the business concerns, not on low-level details like that. They also have an import-export system, which on the surface sounds great, but in reality, it's not. Like practically in Ruby, we don't. It's a lot simpler because we don't have that import-export system, and we don't care. Like it works fine enough for us without it. Ruby works pretty well for us. So there are a lot of differences between JavaScript and Ruby as far as productivity, and there are huge differences. Like I mean, I know like every once in a while, DHH and says online on Twitter or something that he thinks that JavaScript, after they updated it to ECMAScript, has become a great language. But honestly, I don't find it a great language at all. I think he's wrong. I think he's kind of caved into what the popular choice by people is, instead of actually being a leader and being like, no, we could do even better with Ruby. So that's a lot of those aspects are what prompted me to explore building a Glimmer using a front-end Ruby technology. And today in 2024, we do have front-end Ruby technologies. Like we have Opal Ruby, which just won a Fukuoka Ruby Award in 2023. So it's a pretty impressive library that gives you a Ruby to JavaScript transpiler. JavaScript to Ruby transpiler. So that way you can write code that will run as JavaScript in your website, and consumers of your website will not know that it's Ruby, but you actually wrote the code in Ruby first, and it got transpiled to JavaScript. So that's one technology. Another one is Ruby Wasm, which compiles Ruby into like Wasm low-level code, and it basically gives you like all the features of Ruby 3.1 or 3.2 nowadays in the browser. And then there's also Ruby to JS is a third option, but that one is not as comprehensive as the first two options. I don't think you can build everything with it. But yeah, so I ended up choosing Opal as a start for building Glimmer DSL for web. Because I wanted to try the idea out. I tried it out in another project. I had a project called Glimmer DSL for Opal in the past, which is retired now. It's archived. And I was able to prove to myself that I can do everything that Glimmer does on the desktop in a web user interface on the web. And after I proved that idea, I built Glimmer DSL for web starting last year. And it took the approach of being more friendly towards people that know HTML very well or know JavaScript or CSS very well. So it has DSLs that are very close to them, to those languages. So it basically does give you an HTML DSL, a CSS DSL, which is optional. If you want to manage CSS separately, you can, or you could use it. And then the JavaScript aspect got replaced by Ruby. So JavaScript logic code can always be written now with Ruby instead of JavaScript. And anything that you could do in JavaScript, you could do it with Opal Ruby. So Glimmer DSL for web is not limited whatsoever, given that you can integrate with any available JavaScript library out there. For example, I built a sample selector app that lets people visit a Rails app that gives them a bunch of Glimmer samples. And then they select one, and then they see the code syntax highlighted, and then they can launch it in the web because it's a web app. It's a web user like front end apps, and then they can launch it directly in the browser. So the syntax highlighting aspect, I didn't have to implement it myself from scratch. I used a library called Highlight.js, and I was able to integrate it very, very quickly. It took me just a few minutes, or maybe a bit more than 10 minutes. So I mean, I was able to, after I experimented with the idea for quite a while, I took a page, like one of the sophisticated pages in my work website. By the way, I work for Lexop, which is a debt collection agency based in Montreal that uses web technology to reach people that are late at paying their bills, either by email or SMS messages. So we have a Rails app, basically. We're a Rails shop. And right now we're using, we've been using React for the last number of years, but I built a proof of concept where I rewrote a React page that had a table of data with pagination, sorting, and filtering. And I was able to rewrite it in Glimmer DSL for web in about 1 day. but also the performance was just fast enough. Like I didn't feel any like I didn't feel like performance was too slow or anything like that. It was fast enough, and the code was amazing. Like I was able to cut the total code by about half. And also the main React component was about 500 lines of code. And in Glimmer, Glimmer has a very like friendly like OOP approach of following MVC and MVP patterns. And with MVC and MVP, the React component mixes a lot of like data concerns, like it has state hooks and effects, and it mixes like business concerns with the view presentation of the view. Whereas when I rewrote it in Glimmer, it shrunk from 500 lines to 50 lines or something like that. So it was it became a tenth of the size, and all of the data management stuff that React lets you do with state hooks and effects got extracted into logic in a presenter or a model. So like I had an MVP pattern where there's a view, a model, and a presenter. The presenter is kind of like a controller. Like MVP is a variation on MVC. But yeah, the code became a lot better because then I can manage the code with standard OOP for anything that is not view related. That's just mostly logic. So it was. I did a demo of this to my coworkers at work and the CTO, and they were pretty impressed. I'm going to be doing another demo soon to the engineering manager of the company and engineering department manager. Sorry, and we're going to be looking into an idea for rolling it out. If the demo goes well, I hope it would go well. And like one idea for rolling it out is it's not a big bang thing. You don't have to do it everywhere at once. Like the nice thing about front ends on the web is that every web page is a self-contained front end app in a way. So that means for any new web page that we build, we could use Glimmer and keep all the older web pages and whatever old technology we had. But that's not even how we're going to start with it. What we're going to do is basically only internal facing web pages that are in the admin UI are going to start using Glimmer. Glimmer DSL for web is like the idea I'm going to be proposing at the next meeting. And that way we can gradually play around with it in a few admin pages first. And I just want to make sure there aren't any gotchas that I haven't discovered on my own from building my own sample apps. And after we do that for about 4 months or 6 months, then we can start maybe rewriting some admin pages that were in React in Glimmer instead of just adding new pages in Glimmer. And then after that, phase 3 would be start writing new pages on the public-facing website with Glimmer. And then finally, the last phase would be to rewrite React components with Glimmer if we feel like it is needed. It's completely optional, but it could be useful because Glimmer Ruby code is a lot more maintainable than React JS code. Way more, like in my experience, at least double as maintainable.
This is really interesting because we are kind of missing a hard stance on front end in the Rails community at least, but definitely in Ruby as well. And Opal has been kind of the closest thing I've seen. And it's interesting you built kind of like on top of Opal. I know we've had Elia on here before talking about Opal, and it's like really great work. Just so smooth of a process. And I love the DSL you have here in your to-do list app that you've made, which is like so simple and easy to read. We'll share it here in our show notes. So I'm like really curious. A lot of this looks similar to kind of like the Flex markup for those familiar with Joel Draper's Flex project. Where they have like a DSL for kind of building up the DOM elements and mutating them. I'm curious, like, now that you've been like kind of reworking even like React stuff, like what is, as a Ruby developer, like I am assuming that you've developed in Rails?
That I've developed in Rails? What do you mean? Sorry.
Like, yeah, like you've used Rails before, right?
2008 or 2007. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so like, what's been your overall experience, like, as far as like, why move to Glimmer as an example?
Oh, got it.
Like is it kind of straightforward if like a team that hasn't seen Glimmer before to like make the transition pretty easily? I guess you'll
That's
find out.
about it. So there might be a slight misunderstanding. Glimmer is only the front end part. Glimmer integrates with Rails. Glimmer is a Rails library, by the way. It's not just an Opal Ruby library. It's also it's a Rails gem. It integrates with Rails apps and enables you to suddenly in any Rails app be able to write the front end in Ruby. That's it.
That's really cool.
Except it lets you write the front end in Ruby using a nice Glimmer DSL. Like without Glimmer, if I use Opal Ruby alone, you can just write Ruby code in the front end. That's it. But you don't have any support for building frameworks or components or data binding or any of that. Glimmer adds the extra layer that is missing that enables you to do anything you could do with data binding, for example, using it has the same data binding features as Glimmer desktop libraries, but all of those data binding features are actually predate Glimmer. They come from Microsoft technologies. They were used in Visual Basic, I believe, and other Microsoft products. They were also used by some Mac GUI building products as well. So those same ideas got adopted by Vue.js and Svelte. So the same old sort of data binding features that people know from Svelte and Vue.js are available in Glimmer.
Cool.
Except in Glimmer, it's a lot nicer because you write Ruby code instead of JS code, and it also doesn't have the separation between markup is in HTML and logic is in JavaScript. In Ruby, everything is Ruby. The nice thing is for HTML, you have an HTML DSL. For CSS, there's the CSS DSL, and for logic, there's just Ruby. So everything is in one language, so it fits in a lot. So that eliminates the friction between multiple languages, which actually creates a drag on productivity. A lot of people are kind of like the pragmatic book metaphor of the boiled frogs. Have you heard of the boiled frog story from the Pragmatic Programmer book?
No, I'm not familiar.
I can repeat it. It's basically like it's a very interesting book that I highly recommend reading to anyone working in the software development industry. But they're basically saying that like one risk that people get into is becoming boiled frogs. What they mean is like they say if you take a frog and put it in a pot with boiling water, the frog will jump out right away of the pot as a reaction, as a reactive basically reactive behavior. It'll jump right away just to protect its life. But if you put a frog in a pot with water that is cold, and then you raise the heat very gradually, like you turn on the heat and then you raise it very, very gradually, you can boil the frog without it knowing, because it'll boil very, very gradually. So it will not know that it is boiling, but eventually it will boil. So they mentioned that a lot of developers end up in that situation where they use technologies at work that put a drag on their productivity, and they get used to them. And getting used to things is like one of the biggest risks in adopting bad practices in software engineering. So people might like use JavaScript, which has very contradictory paradigms to Ruby, with a Rails application for years and think they're doing the best they could, but in fact, they're actually not doing the best they could. They're creating a drag on productivity because they have multiple languages that have different paradigms, and they're also in their head, they're context switching between the two languages all the time. So I personally noticed, like I pay a lot of attention because of reading that story in the Pragmatic Programmer book. And at first I fell for that trap too. I used JavaScript for many years thinking it was the best thing. But eventually I realized, like I mentioned, I use Glimmer for building desktop apps a lot. I'm like, that's not even like JavaScript development's not even close to that. And so basically a lot of people are boiled frogs in a way. They're not realizing how much productivity they're losing. In my experience, I think Glimmer DSL for web would cut down the work in half in general. So like if you have 12 months of front-end development work in JavaScript and React, you could do it in 6 months in Ruby and Glimmer DSL for web. So that's part of the reason why I'm actually using it with Rails, not against. It's not like I still use Rails for the back end, but Glimmer is kind of like providing a drop-in replacement for your JavaScript libraries that you're adding to Rails. So if you're using Vue.js or Ember or Svelte or Angular or React, like Glimmer can do a lot better than any of those, in my experience, as far as productivity. Assuming, like it has fast enough performance. Like for my work app, the web page with the most elements has only 1,200 elements. And I discovered they render fast enough with Glimmer. I don't even need any of the like performance like advertisements of like React or Svelte for that. Like Opal Ruby is fast enough in my experience. So in general, I think we can follow the 80-20 rule where we can avoid premature optimization, because people tell you, it's the root of all evil in software engineering, because it makes people complicate their code unnecessarily. Like React code is unreadable compared to Ruby code, or like especially like Rails backend code, for example. So like, why are we using it in a Rails app? Like that's contradictory. So I'm trying to provide a way for people to use Ruby on the front end, just like the back end. And that way, that opens the door to things like being able to reuse back-end Ruby logic in the front end directly. So, for example, if I have a few pieces of logic that are validating taxes for payments, or calculating, taxes for like an order, I can actually ship that code to the front end, assuming it has no security restriction requirements on it, and reuse it in the front end directly. So that way, I don't have to write in REST API to reuse it. A lot of developers waste time writing REST APIs to connect JS code to the backend, or they waste time rewriting the backend code in JS. That's another like performance waste or drain. Not productivity drain. So Opal Ruby also saves us from having to do that. Then I can like reuse backend Ruby code directly in the front end where needed. So any secure code remains backend only, and not everything will be opened up to the front end, but things that are reusable on the front end and don't have any security restriction requirements, you can actually reuse them directly in the front end. So, I mean, to answer your question, like I'm using Glimmer to actually improve my productivity in Rails app development, and I would say double it as far as front end development in Rails apps. One other thing you mentioned was Flex. Yeah. One thing to clarify about Flex is only about 2 years old, and the approach they use is actually not different from what Glimmer had for years on the desktop. They let you build components with markup, with a Ruby DSL that lets you build the HTML. But Glimmer desktop libraries lets you do the same thing with components, but instead of using HTML markup in the DSL, you use the desktop control DSL, which it'll give you desktop widgets like list or combo box or text field, etc. So I would say that whatever they came up with, they came after Glimmer. They're not. The Flex approach is not what Glimmer copied. Glimmer just copied its older desktop self. But Flex, thankfully, is another library that is exploring the same ideas for Glimmer, but only on the back end. Like they're doing it, at least for now, they're mainly exploring things on the back end, whereas Glimmer DSL for web is doing it on the front end. Yep. But both of them, to be more fair, both Glimmer and Flex borrowed the idea of writing a DSL for the GUI or the user interface, whether it's using HTML markup or desktop controls. They borrowed that from much older technologies like Shoes or Markabi. Markabi was one of the first DSLs in Ruby, I believe, that allowed people to write HTML in Ruby. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify the history of it. That's all.
Yeah, super interesting. There's been so much work, and to be honest, so many failed attempts as well along the way. But I think we're finally getting somewhere. Looking at your example Rails app here, you have a sample Glimmer DSL web app for Rails. People can check out as well. It definitely makes a lot more sense now as you've been explaining it. Seeing it as like you said, the data binding aspect of connecting the front end components to the back end, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's definitely like we are getting closer here. So I think we're
that's okay. That's okay, because that's exactly how Ruby started. So Ruby started in the 90s, mid 90s, and it took it 10 years before Rails came to fruition. So it wasn't until the mid 2000s that Ruby became very viable on the back end. And now the front end it has a similar story. Opal Ruby started in the mid 2010s, like it might have been 2012 was the first alpha version of it. And it took about 10 years as well to figure out what to do with Opal Ruby on the front end before we arrive at what we think is like the most practical solution. So I agree with you, and I think that's okay. Like it takes time sometimes to figure out how to do things the best way possible.
Yeah, totally. And so like I wanted to dig in here a little bit because what we're talking about is kind of like componentizing like these front end pieces into a more modular way that can be reused and encapsulated in more of the Ruby way, and trying to keep it to Ruby as much as we can, right? Without like degrading the front end performance too much. And so I want to talk about that componentization, like creating these web things, right? Like if I have a form, can I make a form component? Is that like straightforward to do with the Glimmer DSL? What is your experience with like encapsulation there?
Yeah, so to start, the Glimmer HTML DSL gives you access to using any HTML tag, including SVG tags as well. So
Nice.
if you want to use a form tag, you can use it. It's already supported. Every tag that is in HTML is supported by Glimmer right now, Glimmer DSL for web. So you could just use any basic HTML tags out of the box. Now, if you want to build your own components, it also supports that completely right now. For example, if I want to build a name and address form, because that's a very common form that could be used on multiple pages on a website, like for payment, like for shipping, like for many different things, you could definitely do that today. In fact, one of the samples or multiple of the samples include a name and address form, or an address form at least. So it basically abstracts, or like you mentioned, encapsulates all the things related to displaying an address form into a component. It basically will expect you then to provide it an address model. So that way, when you work with it, you don't even have to worry about working with the GUI directly. You just work with the address model. And when you update the address model, because of bidirectional data binding, it'll automatically show updates on the form on the screen. So it'll save developers a lot of work. Like this approach saves developers a lot of work because they don't have to, if you have components that are very well encapsulated, you can just work with their data and their data will automatically reflect in the GUI because of data binding.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I mean, I think that's been one thing that's caused the divide too, to be honest, in that, people like to stylize and make their own web components with React or whatever framework that they've chosen, and handle all their, front end interactions and stuff. But then, have to request that the back end team like help supply that data, or like as data changes, like how do you add and adjust to the component without the data being there on the back end? And so you have this like dual edge coupling, and if we have that coupling anyway, why not have it all in the same place? I think it makes a lot of sense to me personally. So how I'm wondering, like, how does this also like appease like teams that grow in skies and like have devoted front end teams? Like, is there still kind of that? Is this like trying to like consolidate the team structure, or is it also like supporting the idea of, okay, we're going to have front end people that are going to be focusing specifically on styling and adjusting the components? Like, is it still kind of a straightforward process of like HTML, CSS kind of manipulation for front end styling of the components, or is it take more of like I need to learn Glimmer DSL, aspect of things?
So one thing to clarify is that Glimmer DSL for web in the end generates real JavaScript, real HTML, and real CSS. Like when you use it, you will generate like standard HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So if people have concerns about testing like the front end user interfaces, they can just test them as basic HTML. They don't have to even be involved in the Ruby part. If people are backend developers that know backend Ruby and they use it with Rails, now this opens the door completely for them to use Glimmer on the front end. So that actually in my experience, improves productivity in a number of ways. Usually it's recommended to do full stack development, not back end, front end. At least in my company, we definitely, and a few other companies I worked at in the past, that's definitely the approach we adopted, because then the developer is aware of the full value being offered to the customer end to end, from the user interface all the way down to the database and then back. So then they can optimize the code or simplify the code as with a better understanding of like the holistic view of everything, and be able to provide a better product to customers in general. And also, it in my experience, results in less work and less communication overhead. When there are front-end and back-end developers, there's communication overhead. There's more work about translating things from the back-end to the front-end and vice versa. And if there are multiple languages, that's even worse. Then like there's even more translation going on. So this enables now backend developers to just do front-end work and not worry anymore about that. So in a way, it saves companies from actually it cuts down the hiring costs, because companies that have backend developers, they don't even need, like if there's a startup that wants to be as efficient as possible, as productive as possible, they don't even have to hire front-end developers anymore if they have solid backend Ruby developers. So that's a very big win. But on the other hand, if there are companies that have backend, front-end developers, front-end developers would learn this just like learning any other front-end library. Because, for example, React definitely had a very large, like a big learning curve in a sense, because they had JSX, which was not a normal based. It's not a standard technology. JSX is actually not standard HTML, not standard CSS, not even standard JavaScript. So it's very weird. And like React has a lot of weird things that, in my opinion, like waste a lot of productivity to learn. Like, why are we working with low-level state when we actually have object-oriented programming languages that are way more advanced? They have the same idea. So in my mind, React reinvents OOP in a different way and gives it a different name. Like basically, object attributes are called state hooks in React, and object observers, they call them effects in React, and that's it. Like React is not really, it's just reinventing things. It's not really as modern and new as people think it is. For people that have been software engineering for a long time, they could tell that React's ideas have been around since the 90s at least. Like the idea of components has been around since the 90s from Visual Basic, for example. So anyways, in the end, I found it more productive to, like in React, you have to open weird curly braces to mix logic with view concerns. So if I want to say, if this, do this, if that, do that, it's a bit weird opening the curly braces. It's very hard to integrate the logic with the view. Whereas in Ruby and Glimmer DSL for web, you are in Ruby already. You're just using a Ruby DSL. You can actually write if and that immediately in the same language. And also, it's even better than ERB as well, because ERB requires that developers open scriptlets to mix logic with view like concerns. Sorry, not the concerns, but more it's actually presentation logic. It's not really, it is view logic. But yeah, to mix it with view structure, you have to open scriptlets, which can get really annoying after a while. And over a year adds up so much that it would actually present a drag on productivity, which goes back to that boiled frog metaphor that I spoke of earlier. So in a way, I would say JavaScript developers that are worth their salt, that are actually smart, solid software engineers, should be able to pick up Glimmer DSL for web in no time and then be more productive in it than using JavaScript.
I see. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Looking at more of these examples in this Rails sample, you're using like an external code highlighter, which is really cool. And it's just like all in Ruby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really, really cool. So I'm curious, what is the what's the deploy process look like for this stuff? Like, is it the same as, any Rails app, any Ruby app? What's that look like?
So I'm using the Opal Rails gem, which is 100% compliant with the Rails classic asset pipeline. So it runs on top of sprockets. So it's actually very simple. It brings us back to the old simple days of CoffeeScript and older JavaScript before we had to start using crazy bundlers like Webpack. I mean, in my opinion, that's a benefit because Webpack, like at my job, maintaining Webpack is such a monstrosity with all its options and configuration settings that like upgrading it is a very difficult process. Like I recently upgraded it from an old version to a newer one, and it was absolute hell. It took more than a month to finish the work. This just runs on top of sprockets. So meaning you just do a Rails asset precompile when you deploy to production, and it generates JavaScript files, and that's it. And then you put the JavaScript files in a CDN, so then people will download them with instant like download speeds, and the website will be very like high performance as a result of that. And locally on my machine, there's no bundler again. There's just Opal Rails, the gem. So what that means is every time I hit a web page, the Opal code gets compiled on the spot in development. So that way, as I update the code and I refresh the web page, it picks up the newer changes. That said, I heard from the Opal people that they are working on like a way to integrate Opal with bundlers like Webpack, and they might already have, I believe they already have like proofs of concepts of it, or maybe even working versions. But I'm personally not interested in using them. In my mind, like a big benefit is avoiding Webpack, because like my way of doing things, I would say with this is to not use a bundler. I would, in any third-party libraries, I would link to their CDNs. That's fast enough and good enough. I realize that bundlers give you chunking and other features that people will say will give you even better performance. But like for most apps that are smaller startup Rails apps or mid-sized apps, which is what Rails is used for the most, I'd rather not use a bundler. I'd rather just have things bundled with Rails asset precompile on deploy, and locally it would just compile live when I'm doing development.
Yeah, totally. And thinking more about like the bundler aspect of it, it makes me think of was it Rails Assets, if you were familiar with that, where Rails Assets was like basically just a gem format where you could pull in node related npm packages into your Rails asset pipeline, which was to me like super great. It didn't require any of the JavaScript packaging systems or extra dependencies like that, and it worked great. And you just bundle install, and it included all of the assets that you needed and handled all that. And I do miss that. And so I'm hopeful with this kind of push here that we can kind of get back to something like that, which brings me to my next topic of Turbo. What are your feelings on Turbo and like the HTML over the wire aspects of Rails?
So Turbo is nice if I have a very simple business app and I need very, very few like front-end interactions without writing front-end code. I can use Turbo for that, like where it would update certain parts of the screen automatically based on back-end directives from a controller action. So I think for simpler apps, it works fine. For more sophisticated apps, it doesn't do everything. And that's the reason why a lot of Rubyists nowadays reach for React and other JavaScript libraries like Svelte and Vue.js, is because they at one point hit a wall or feel like it's too complicated to manage Turbo from controllers on the back end than to actually just write front end code. And I think I think Turbo in a way is a bit like written in with the approach of being a bit aversive to writing front end JavaScript code, because JavaScript code is not nice. But if we had a front end language that was nice, and we do now in 2024, which is Ruby using Opal or Wasm, then there's no reason for me to consider Turbo in that case. I would rather just write front end Ruby code the normal way and like following an MVC pattern, and that should be good enough. Like and I can just make REST API calls. I mean, at my job, people do that anyways with React right now. They connect React to the backend with REST API calls. So, I mean, I feel like that's simple enough, and a lot of people are comfortable with that model. One thing about Turbo is it has a bit of a learning curve, and because its model is a bit like out of the normal, out of the ordinary, the mental model. So people have to think a lot about IDs on elements in HTML. So in my experience, I feel like writing features in Glimmer DSL for web is simpler because I'm just writing basic Ruby code. I don't have to worry about IDs. You can just use variables the normal Ruby way, and variables will identify elements. You can grab elements by variable instead of by ID. In general, you don't have to refer to IDs and elements. So it's simpler than jQuery. It's simpler than, in my mind, a bit than the mental model of Turbo. And it can do things that are fully like just front-end only interactions that don't even talk to the back end. As far as I know, Turbo is usually augmented by Stimulus. I find Stimulus's code a bit boilerplate-ish, and because it requires people to write controllers, I find that a bit too verbose personally. I feel like it's not dry enough. It could be drier, but also it's written in JavaScript, which is very ugly compared to back-end Ruby code. Like even if I'm writing a tiny bit of sprinkles in JavaScript, if I can write them in Ruby, it would be even better.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Definitely and having the context switch constantly between the two definitely slows down the development. For me personally, I don't want to speak for everyone, but yeah, I mean, I feel like we've been driving, like we keep talking about this, we keep driving toward like a more like view component style, like, application development process that is getting closer. And this seems to be like crossing that bridge of the missing pieces too of, well, we still need JavaScript libraries are still helpful. Like, how do we use them in the context of our application, but not have to just use JavaScript to couple our backends? And so this is
one of the issues with previous attempts at providing a front-end development library for that would use Ruby, like Opal Ruby, for example. There was a much older framework called Vault that was a bit popular around 2015 or 2016. Vault was basically providing people with a full isomorphic approach to development on the web, so that you write the front end with Vault using the Ruby, and they might have had a DSL, and then on the back end, they basically have models that can establish connections to the back end directly without you writing controllers or writing REST APIs on the back end, if I remember right. So it was a very innovative approach. It had very good ideas. The issue with it was that it forced people to change their mental model for Rails too much. And that's a problem. Like if somebody wrote a Rails app that is doing very good for their business and it's been around for 5 years, it might be too much to ask for them to change their entire app's approach right away to something like Vault. So Glimmer is aiming to intentionally provide the simplest possible thing that you could use to augment your Rails app with something better on the front end, and no more than that. So I intentionally just provide a drop-in replacement for your JavaScript library on the front end. And the nice thing about it is JavaScript front end apps are, every page is its own app. So if you have older things built with jQuery or React in the past, it doesn't matter. You can start any new pages with using Glimmer, and it's very easy to add it, and you can get started very quickly. My plan behind that is it would expand gradually in the future so that more and more pieces can be added if people want to optionally. So you mentioned that now things are coming together in a way because finally, like on the back end, we have things like Flex or View Component, and on the front end, there's Glimmer DSL for web. My idea is to actually extend Glimmer support to the back end as well. So eventually, you write your Glimmer web components on the front end. And then I want to support server-side rendering of them on the back end. So that way on the back end, you don't have to use ERB anymore. You drop ERB and replace it with a much simpler Glimmer DSL. But you would it would work kind of like View Component or Flex. Like the back-end controller actions will just render Glimmer components. And if you render them from the back end on first hit of the website, they will first render the HTML, and then they will hydrate and add the JavaScript layer on top of that. So there will be a bit of work to explore that idea, but that idea is on the horizon. Another idea I had in mind was to actually replace ERB files with a simpler solution called GRB. So GRB would be Glimmer RB, which is basically files that look like ERB, except instead of using template style like scriptlet syntax, you would use the Glimmer DSL directly in them. So that's another idea I have. So I have a few ideas on the horizon to enable people to more and more improve their Rails way of rendering views and componentizing their views, and hopefully eventually, once I add more and more of those ideas, I guess the fourth idea would be to do what Vault was doing, which is to have front-end models act as proxies for back-end models. If you do that, then Rails developers don't even have to write controllers anymore. You don't have to worry about, so you're gonna, I can remove all of the boilerplate code of writing controllers out, and then I can remove all the boilerplate code of writing JavaScript services out, like REST services. And that way I can connect JavaScript front-end models directly to active record or back-end models in Rails, which is kind of like what Vault and also Hyperstack, which is another Opal Ruby library, does. Unfortunately, both of them are no longer maintained, or at least Hyperstack hasn't had a release in 3 years. I don't know if it is maintained still, but either way, I think that's a very important thing in software engineering, is incremental development, like iterative incremental development. And in a way, Glimmer is adopting that approach for rolling out its features, where people can start with a drop-in replacement for their JavaScript front-end library, then move on to a back-end technology like either GRB or rendering front-end components on the back-end directly. And finally, it would be like replacing their controller layer completely with like a model proxy layer that would bypass the whole REST API thing, or it would basically automate it so that I don't have to write REST code myself directly. So yeah, these are some of the ideas in the pipeline for Glimmer DSL for web.
Yeah, very awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing that come together. I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah, me too.
So like this brings me to my like last kind of question, I guess, is like the, how does, are there any plans to bridge the gap of consolidating the application development to allow automatically creating both for web and desktop and mobile and XYZ? Like, is that a desirable future, or is that better to keep things separate still?
So I explored that idea with my older Glimmer web library. It was called Glimmer DSL for Opal. It was just a library that was exploring using Opal to render user interfaces. And the approach of that library actually was very different from Glimmer DSL for web. Its approach was actually to hide HTML and CSS completely from developers, so that they actually work with a GUI mental model that was similar to the desktop. It even used the same widget or control names, like you could say tag names, that were used for building the Eclipse SWT library. So it was trying to match the syntax of Glimmer DSL for SWT. What that enabled is basically I could take any desktop game or app that was built with Glimmer DSL for SWT and run its code in Glimmer DSL for web without writing HTML or CSS. Like I would just keep the same exact desktop code in Ruby, and it would run the app in the browser. So I was able to run Tetris, for example, that way. I built it for the desktop, and it ran on the web with the same exact code, which was pretty impressive. But however, practically speaking, from a business web development point of view, I don't think it's a very practical idea. I think most developers want to know about HTML and CSS, and they want to do things following more the web way. And if I hide HTML, CSS from them, I don't think they'd be pleased. But also, if I were to take the other approach, which is use HTML, CSS on the desktop, that causes the other issue, which is desktop developers write a lot less code because they don't have to muck with HTML, CSS. Desktop GUI libraries are usually simpler than web stuff. So I think it's better to just keep the two technologies in a way separate with their DSLs. Because I believe web requirements are different from desktop requirements.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know, having worked with React Native, it is painful even just between separate provider platforms of iOS and Android, and having to do Windows and Linux and managing that, I can't imagine that's helpful to have to do for everything.
Yeah, this is one of those ideas that sound good on paper, but when you start actually following them in practice, they're not very practical. Like I know people. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Well, this is awesome. I love seeing this work happening, and you have so many great examples here. That brings me to kind of like, before the show we were talking about, you're gearing up for your RubyConf talk and workshop. Do you want to shed some light on the workshop that you're doing, and maybe how people can start to get involved in a lot of this Glimmer stuff you're building?
Yeah, sure. This year, so I'll be presenting a newer version of the same workshop I conducted last year. It was a 2-hour workshop called How to Build Desktop Applications in Ruby in 2023. In 2024, it's going to be How to Build Basic Desktop Applications in Ruby. This one is going to be limiting the workshop content to the basics of desktop development so that it gives people more time to breathe and also digest the ideas related to MVC pattern, MVP, and bidirectional and unidirectional data binding. So it will give people a lot more time to be able to play around and learn a desktop version of Glimmer. So the version used is going to be the Fukuoka Ruby Award, the one that won the Fukuoka Ruby Award. It'll be Glimmer DSL for libui. This library, actually, the nice thing about it is that you just install the Ruby gem and you're good to go. So I actually do include in the workshop description the instructions. Like I tell people, just install the Ruby gem and then run a sample to make sure it works and you're good to go. So I'll be basically using that library as an educational library for building very small desktop app. So Glimmer DSL for libui, what's good about it is it's very good for very simple apps. You can build them very quickly. And also it's good for apps that are mostly tools or productivity tools or development-related tools that can help with your day-to-day work, because it's a very good library for packaging apps as gems. So you can package anything, like you can scaffold an app with it. It supports scaffolding features similar to Rails, but for desktop apps. And then you can package your scaffolded app as a gem very quickly, and then you can give it to others, and people would just install the gem and use it. So I would recommend this library the most for people that want to build productivity tools for day-to-day work. If you want to package your app as a Mac app or a Windows app, this library does have 2 options for doing it, and its Windows option works very well. Its Mac option is very new. There's a guy that packaged it on the Mac just a few months ago, and I documented what he did. He actually documented what he did in a blog post that I linked to. So it does offer some packaging options, but they're not the most complete or comprehensive today. I have other libraries like Glimmer DSL for SWT lets you package your apps as real native apps with like an exe or MSI installer on Windows, or DMG file or PKG file on Mac, or even Debian files on Linux or RPM. So that one, if people want to build a more serious app, I would recommend Glimmer DSL for SWT. But if they're building a very quick productivity app or small app that will show a table that is summarizing data from a database, I would recommend Glimmer DSL for libui.
Yeah, I was looking at their README with all the examples. It's pretty slick. It has like all of the major components that you'd want to use to build a simple desktop app from the first glance. So very cool.
Yeah, and one cool thing that I've been doing is actually whenever I add features to, say, Glimmer DSL for libui that I think are useful, I end up also adding them to Glimmer DSL for web. Like one such a feature is component slots. So now if I build, for example, a name and address form, like I mentioned earlier, as an example, I can add slots in it, and people can contribute tags or like markup inside those slots. In a desktop app, there would be contributing controls. So that way people can, for example, add a message at the top of the name and address form between the name and the address that can inform people of something, or they can add another form, like a nested form within it, or do stuff like that. So I mean, this feature is called component slots. It's borrowed from the web component slots standard. Like on the web, in the HTML web component standard, they do have the idea of slots. So it's kind of borrowed from that. It's also borrowed from, I think, Vue component, the library, the Rails library has slots as well. So anyways, that's something that I ended up adding to Glimmer DSL for libUI first, and then I added it to Glimmer DSL for web. And it works very well because then it enables any, like if you take any component, you're not limited by what the people who built the component did in it. You can actually open it up and like it follows the open close principle. You can open any like component up without touching its code. So it's closed for modification, but it's open for extension, and you can add anything to that component in the slots that are designated for the changes for anything to add.
Yeah, very cool. I love to see all the examples here. How do you find time for all this?
Nights and weekends, especially long weekends like Labor Day weekend or whatever. Any long weekends,
yeah,
I end up using them for this. But
that's so fun.
It's my passion project, and also, in my opinion, I really think the current front-end development experience in Rails is very, very bad. Like every time I receive a PR on a React component at work, I'm like, wow, this code is absolutely awful. And it's the best code they could write, by the way. I'm not faulting whoever wrote the code. It's the React way, but React's code is so absolutely awful. And I mean, so I dabbled with other approaches. Like I was going to consider recommending Svelte or Vue.js at work, but then that's when I thought about Glimmer and Ruby, and I'm like, wow, I could even do better than Svelte and Vue. And in my opinion, I succeeded at that. So I think part of it is passion. Like I'm very passionate about Ruby open source projects. But the other part of it is also thinking seriously about how to improve our development productivity for customers, because this is a game changer. If you can save 6 months, a year of development work because you're using front-end Ruby instead of JavaScript, that's an absolute game changer. And that code is also going to be more maintainable for years to come. So it'll be cheaper to maintain for years to come as well. And on top of it, basically it pays for itself. So like if people try to give you an excuse of, oh, I don't have time to check out this library or try it out, I'd be like, no, you don't have time not to check it out. Because right now you're spending 6 months more every year using another library. If you spend only 2 or 3 weeks learning this library, you're going to save like 5 weeks and a half or so. So it's actually paying for its own investment automatically, like just by exploring this library. So in my opinion, that's another reason why I'm into it. I believe it's going to enhance my work experience significantly if we adopt it in my company right now.
Yeah, totally. I could see that for sure. And I would love to see somebody maybe ingesting some of these examples to AI to help with, get adjusting to the DSL, because that's probably one of the biggest aspects of learning new frameworks, to me personally, at least.
Not in Glimmer DSL for web as much, because it intentionally honors the HTML markup language almost exactly as is. So, for example, if you want to use an on-click listener, any on-click attributes or on-change or on anything, they're all supported automatically in Glimmer. So, like all your knowledge you'll be able to transfer it to Glimmer, but following a different way. You just have to write the code with less code. Like instead of opening and closing every tag, you don't have to open and close the tags anymore. You can just put the tag name and then open a block with curly braces and then close up curly braces and you're done. So it's more dry. Like people who write HTML don't write dry code, because HTML itself is not dry. I mean, that's part of the reason why XML became obsolete and people started using JSON, because JSON is a lot drier than XML. But unfortunately, in web view development, like people haven't made that transition yet. So this approach is like one key reason for the design of Glimmer DSL for web being different from Glimmer DSL for Opal was to enable people to not have much of a learning curve. They can just transfer their HTML skills as is. So like any attributes on any elements are supported by Glimmer DSL for web, and any listeners are supported, and any and then all the same tags are supported by their same name. It's just with a slightly different syntax that's actually less code than HTML.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna have to play with this around myself because it looks like a lot of fun. All right, we're kind of getting to the time here. Is there anything else you wanted to share or talk about before we wind down to picks?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
Yeah, I mean you're doing it all, it seems. I love to see all of the the options that people have even within the Glimmer ecosystem. It's really please keep it up because I think you're heading in the right way. So let's move to picks. Do you have anything, or you want me to go first? I can give you some time.
I don't think I have anything, to be honest. I think the topic of this podcast will give people a lot of stuff to check out already. So like I would recommend checking out, the Glimmer DSL for Web GitHub project. Run like the online hosted sample and play around with it. It has a bunch of samples written in Ruby. And then lastly, I would recommend obviously for everyone to build a Rails, like a new Rails app from scratch, and then integrate Glimmer DSL for Web into it, and then play around with it.
Yeah, totally. That's the path I'm going to take. I don't really have too much to share here, other than I'm building a robot arm.
Cool.
It by Hugging Face. It's called Le Robot, and you can train it to do things. It has it's 2 arms, but it has like a follower arm and a leader arm. And so you can lead the other one and show it how to pick up things and push buttons. And I hope that one day I can get it to type on the keyboard and look at my screen and then just work for me. But it's a lot of fun. I'm just to the assembly phase. I completed that, and it's been a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to diving.
The leader arm. Do you control the leader arm directly, or do you give it voice commands, or does it follow your arm using a camera with AI AI vision?
So this particular one, they have a couple different versions of the arms, but this one they have you basically have 2 of the same kind of arm, and you can move one of them that moves the other in the same ways, so it mirrors it. They call it teleoperation. But they have you can have multiple robot arms, so you can have multiple leaders, multiple followers, and so there is a camera aspect that lets you train and learn kind of what is happening that way. And so I think maybe in the future it will get to the point where you could just use your own arms and hands. But I think right now it's just because the dexterity is not there yet. It's just 2 arms and you train one with the other kind of thing.
So what are some applications of this robot's arm? What could you use it for that you think could be?
So right away, I had a bunch of screws that were all different sizes that came in the same package, and I want to just sort it rather than me sort the screws. So that will probably be my first one, because it's they're tiny screws and they're hard to sort, and that should be something easy, or not easy, but straightforward to train the arm to do. But their examples that they have are Lego sorting, right? Finding the right colors. I think they had one example where they're, pushing buttons on something else. So I don't really know what I'm going to do with it yet. It's mostly just fun to explore all of this real world AI aspect stuff. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So check that out if you're interested. Le Robot. Well, it's been awesome talking to you, Andy. I appreciate you coming on again, and all the work you're doing in this space, because we need it, and I love to do more Ruby than anything else. So I appreciate it, and if people want to reach out to you or find you on the internet, how do they do that?
They can find me on LinkedIn. I'm just Andy Malley on LinkedIn, I have a Twitter. It's called Andy Optiva, at Andy Obtiva. And what else? And then if they need to reach out to me about Glimmer directly, if they visit the GitHub project, there's a Gitter chat link. So they can click on the Gitter chat link, and that would take them to a chat room that is all about Glimmer.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, and thank you for listening,
Thanks for having
everybody. Yep. And, until next time, more Ruby on the way.